Now, one thing I've always liked and appreciated about the Star Wars prequel trilogy was the fact that what you might call the power levels seen in those films were more or less on par or in line with what we saw in the original Sith running around doing crazy things or using insane force powers, that there wasn't what you might call a power creep. Instead, it was pretty much the exact same powers that were being used before. There were just many more beings running around. Gave you incredible reflexes, enough so to use a lightsaber extremely efficiently, even to the point of blocking and redirecting blaster bolts. And if you were on the dark side, your power capped out at Force Lightning that you could use to zap essentially one target, though even this was balanced out by Lightsiders having the ability, if they were powerful enough themselves, to catch and redirect or dissipate that Force Lightning. Basically, the Force was something that gave those that used it, yes, some pretty impressive abilities and a clear-cut advantage over anyone who wasn't able to use it, but not so much so that they were like near invincible gods or anything even close to it. In fact, regular or non-Force sensitive individuals like Mandalorians, or like we see out of Cad Bane in the Clone Wars, they could close the gap with enough training and go toe-to-toe with a Jedi. Response by Qui-Gon Jinn, after Anakin boldly declares personally seen otherwise, that has known Jedi who have fallen in battle, who knows all too well that Jedi have limits, and one that knows and accepts his own limits. Which is all a huge part of being a Jedi, acknowledging and accepting not only what you can and cannot do, but also what you should and should not do with your power, that you should never use it for selfish reasons or seek power simply for the sake of it. There should always be a purpose to everything you do with it, and a good one at that. Anakin Skywalker, who, despite having incredible potential, even more so than Yoda according to his midichlorian count, despite having that potential, he was never content and always wanted more and more power, in order to gain more and more control over, because to achieve power with it, which I'm not saying is even their intent per se, but to achieve power with the lights, trust their instincts and seek to help others for the sake of helping others. You could even say that for a Jedi, knowing how to use the power of the light side properly is what gives them that power in the first place, or perhaps I should say allows them to better access it, that attaining wisdom and achieving serenity having the Force and use it, or at least the light side of the Force. Which is why a Force user can just as easily, or much easier actually, why they can fall to the dark side of the Force and become powerful with it, because it doesn't require discipline to attain, and in many ways it requires kind of the opposite, which, not to get too deep into this topic here, but it's one of the reasons I've never been a fan of the idea of Grey Jedis. You simply cannot be calm and focused on the greater good, and angry and focused on the self at the same time. But anyway, the big difference between the two is that the dark side is simply easier. It's easier to take the quick and easy path to get angry and go after what you want, to seek instant gratification, than it is to achieve the wisdom and discipline necessary to put the needs of others ahead of your own, and achieve long-term joy not only for the self, but for others as well. And in my opinion, this is all one of the most valuable lessons that Star Wars tries to teach us, that you shouldn't have power till you first learn how to use it, that it should not only be given to or wielded by those we quickly, even when we have the best of intentions, as Anakin did, we quickly become greedy and self-righteous. One that gets summed up quite nicely by Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. Because the thing is, superheroes tend to have all their powers given to them or thrust upon them, and oftentimes not by choice. They usually have it given to them all at once or in one single moment or because of one single incident. It's not something they tend to be born with and then very gradually learn to control and master through many years of training. And even if they are born with it, it usually still just unlocks one day. Basically, for superheroes in general, one day they're like everyone else, and the next they have superhuman abilities that make them far and away superior to the average person. Whereas future Jedi are born with a connection to a greater force that you could say they can use to some degree naturally or instinctively or without any training whatsoever. To reach full potential with the Force for a Jedi, it can only be achieved through patience, through years and years of training and acquired. Again, learning how to use it properly is what gives them the ability to use it to the fullest extent. And I think Luke in The Mandalorian put it best when he said talent without training is nothing. Because Jedi don't wake up one day and realize they have the Force, go through a brief training montage like we see in your average superhero movie, and then they're ready to face off against the bad guy. They don't have this one singular moment where all the power is thrust upon them, where they simply have to maybe shut their eyes, let the Force in, and then they're suddenly able to not only face off against a Sith or equivalent bad guy, but are able to defeat them. And my one big fear when I heard the name of that for the very first time, when I heard the name of the first Star Wars film in the Disney era, well, I had this fear that what Star Wars was about to be turned into was something akin to a superhero franchise. That the title The Force Awakens might be implying that for those 1,000 generations the Jedi had been the guardians of peace and justice, using it, again, to mainly augment mundane abilities, that the Force had actually, I don't know, been somewhat dormant the whole time. The Force was about to awaken, and powers were about to start getting crazy, or at least more, shall we say, extravagant than we had seen before. I even thought Kylo's line from the trailer about finishing what you started, spoken to the mask of Darth Vader, was referring to something Vader had tried to do to awaken the Force, and the reason why I thought this could be the case, and likely would be, that Star Wars was about to change and the Force was going to get more, which is arguably during the very height of the Marvel superhero craze. The film would have been made in the wake of the first Avengers film, which is what I think pushed the genre into the stratosphere. Discussing if kids these days would find Jedi as cool as superheroes, or if they'd maybe find them a little too tame and boring by comparison, if what amounts to warrior monks with laser swords can sell as much merchandise as a playboy billionaire in a fancy metal suit. Couple that then with the fact that they really wanted to try and appeal even more so to women and young girls than Star Wars had apparently. And we ended up with Rey, the superhero, the Jedi of the sequel trilogy. And honestly, in all reality, Rey's story did end up feeling more like what you would see in a superhero movie than what you would see in us immediately. Then she had to figure out what in the world to do with it. Of boulders a couple days after learning the Force even existed. And it was this power creep that quickly led to other abilities as crazy as passing items across the galaxy itself, across time and space because of a dyad, which is arguably the most insane thing we've ever seen in Star Wars when you really stop and think about it. Not even Marvel's Thor, a literal god of thunder and a superhero, could do something like that. And don't get me wrong here, I am pretty much okay with some level of power creep in Star Wars, with seeing new and different things out of the Force from time to time, but you have to be careful, very careful with how far you go and how it all gets explained, if it gets explained. Because if in the sequels we had learned that Anakin balancing the Force, as we see at the end of Return of the Jedi when he tosses Palpatine down that shaft and then kills Darth Vader essentially in the process, if we had learned that had somehow awakened some dormant aspect of the Force, that it was part of the prophecy somehow, well, that already sounds way more interesting than what we got. As long as, again, it doesn't suddenly feel like, and for me, and as always, you don't have to agree with me, but for me, it was that unexplained power creep and misunderstanding of how the Force even works in the first place that were the biggest underlying issues with the sequels, and I know you might say there were other bigger problems, but if the foundation is faulty, then everything else built upon it is going to suffer. Sequels managed to make the Force feel the same as it did in the original trilogy. We just again saw more beings than ever before using it, and frequently using it to the fullest potential because they were all highly trained. It wasn't strange to see a bunch of Jedi Masters using some pretty cool abilities, whereas in the sequels we see characters who had never trained for even a day doing things more powerful than we had seen out of those fully trained Jedi Master characters in the prequels. Because now in the Kenobi series, we've seen things like Darth Vader snatch a ship out of the air and then rip it to pieces with the Force, which sure, you could argue is something he would be capable of. Grab the Millennium Falcon when it's escaping the hangar bay on Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back, or why not just rip Luke's ship apart in A New Hope when he's in the trench right in front of him, or at the very least, take hold of his ship for a moment and just send it careening into the Death Star itself. We also have things like Obi-Wan lifting and flinging a ton of boulders, and doing this a day after, in story, that he could barely move a small piece of metal with the Force, and after struggling to catch Leia as she fell a few days prior to that. He certainly got back on that bike and remembered how to ride very, very quickly, didn't he? Which I wouldn't have too much of a problem with if the things he ended up doing with the rocks wasn't quite so crazy. Outshine the one already known by inflating it and making things or characters more powerful in order to make it more exciting, in order to get you to watch. Was actually pulled this off rather well. There wasn't much of a power creep, certainly not as much as we have seen since then. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about power creep in Star Wars. Do you think the Force is a bit too dealing like it always has, or it used to anyway? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.